Hello and welcome to the Gaggle What We Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a podcast on the current state of play with regard to the upcoming summit in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin. So, as you know, last Thursday it was announced first by the Kremlin and then confirmed by the White House that a summit would take place between the two presidents, and that some neutral place would have to be found, and eventually, to the surprise of many, because the expectation was that the summit would take place in, somewhere like the United Arab Emirates, or maybe Hungary, or somewhere where it's a country that's is well disposed towards Russia and well disposed towards the United States. But to everybody's surprise, President Trump announced that the meeting would take place in Alaska. And of course, the location of Alaska does have a certain historic resonance because, of course, it had belonged to the Russian Empire up until the 1860s when Tsar Alexander II sold it really very inexpensively. He sold it to the United States. At the time, it seemed like not a bad deal for Russia. They didn't get a whole lot of money for it, but they didn't look like there was anything very much there. Some fur trade and so on. But this was before the discovery of gold, and then Alaska did indeed become rather valuable. And of course, Alaska is what makes the United States an Arctic power, and therefore very heavily involved in the negotiations about the exploitation of the Arctic. Um, so it obviously has historic importance for both countries. Um, However, it is U.S. territory, and it's was surprising that President Putin would agree to meet on U.S. territory. And of course, he's not worried about being arrested on the basis of an ICC warrant because, of course, the United States, like Russia, does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, and so therefore, would would do nothing at all to advance its agenda. Benjamin Netanyahu is also wanted by the ICC, and of course he visited the United States and was toasted by U.S. officials, and the question of his arrest clearly did not come up. So I don't think President Putin has any worries on that score. Um, What's interesting now is, of course, to speculate as to what may happen during this summit. And it was President Trump who kind of put the cat among the pigeons by suggesting on Friday that some deal on Ukraine is in the works, and that this deal would involve land swaps. And so here is what he said on Friday evening. And let's just take a look. Because this has caused, as you might expect, a great deal of agitation.
I will say that Europe wants to see peace. The European leaders want to see peace. President Putin, I believe, wants to see peace, and Zelenskyy wants to see peace. Now, President Zelenskyy has to get all of his everything he needs, because he's going to have to get ready to sign something, and I think he is working hard to get that done. Well, you're looking at territory that's been fought over for 3.5 years with, a lot of Russians have died, a lot of Ukrainians have died. So we're looking at that, but we're actually looking to get some back and some swapping. It's complicated. It's actually nothing easy. It's very complicated, but we're going to get some back. We're going to get uh, some switched. There'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both. And but we'll be talking about that either later or tomorrow or whatever.
All right. Here you can see that he's talking about swapping territory. And not only that, he's saying President Zelensky is going to have to sign something. Well, with the obvious suggestion that he's going to have to sign something that President Zelensky will not be very happy to sign. Now, as we've said many times here at the Gaggle, it has been this long enduring nightmare for Zelensky, but more important to America's NATO partners. The long enduring nightmare that President Trump will come into office and will demand that Ukraine sign an agreement that, in effect, ratifies Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory and sets in stone a Western pledge that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. Because basically, America's European partners in NATO know that Trump really doesn't care very much about NATO, though he now purports to be an enthusiast for NATO. It's only because the NATO countries have promised to buy lots and lots and lots of military hardware from the United States, and they've all promised to increase their military expenditures, and that therefore America will have very little to complain about, and because they're going to be making money from as a result of this European investment, and so the bad feelings that Trump and even to a lesser extent previous American presidents had this bad feeling that essentially America was carrying the burden of NATO on its own shoulders, and that the other members of NATO were not pulling their weight. That's disappeared, and therefore Trump will be well satisfied with NATO, and that is in fact what has happened since Trump returned to office. But nonetheless, there were always these lingering doubts in Europe that somehow Trump will revert to his America first, non-interventionist ideas, and therefore he will abandon the Ukraine project. And therefore, if he abandons the Ukraine project, he will essentially make the Europeans look like fools because of this huge commitment that they had made back in 2022. And so the worst European nightmares appear to be confirmed by that terrible confrontation in the Oval Office between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Zelensky in the early days of the administration. And when that happened, all of the Europeans, all the Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron quickly rallied around Zelensky. They embraced Zelensky, but they also told him to eat humble pie and make nice with the United States. He cannot afford to enrage the Trump administration. He needs them on side. But then in recent months, as we've highlighted here time and time again at the Gaggle, Trump seemed to have switched his his predilections, and he seems to be now much more in favor of Ukraine and much more antagonistic toward Russia. So where he used to speak highly of Russia, speak highly of President Putin. Now he seems to often just speak in a very disparaging way about Putin. Remember he famously said, he keeps throwing bullshit at us, and he talks nice on the phone, and then he goes and blows up another building. And Trump was saying, "Well, I've had enough of this." And so much so that he pledged that he will be delivering more military hardware to Ukraine with the one proviso. What would distinguish him supposedly from the Biden administration was that the military hardware would be purchased by the Europeans. They would purchase it from the United States, so the money going into the American military industrial complex, they would purchase it, and then they would transfer this first-rate American military equipment to Ukraine. The Europeans were absolutely delighted with this. Yeah, and include us in. We want to be a part of this arrangement. But not content with that, Trump upped the ante against Russia by seemingly embracing the policy of secondary sanctions. The secondary sanctions against the countries that purchase Russian fuel, Russian oil and Russian gas. So he had this, in Congress, Figures like Lindsey Graham, who were threatening to pass legislation promising 500% tariffs on China and India for purchasing Russian fossil fuels. And Trump said, well, instead of 500%, I think I'm going to go for 100%. And he has indeed hit India with 50% tariffs. And he explicitly made clear that he's hitting India with these 50% tariffs because India is purchasing oil from Russia. And of course, Trump left open the possibility that he's going to hit others, including China, of course, but maybe even including his good friend Hungary, because Hungary also is entirely reliant on imports of Russian fossil fuels. So that was the state of play until the meeting in Moscow between Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and President Putin. And the meeting seemed to go so well that the Russians announced the summit is in the works. The White House confirmed it. And of course, in light of what Trump had just said about the swaps, and that Zelenskyy is going to have to sign something that he obviously isn't going to be very happy with, this has caused enormous aggravation and consternation among America's partners in NATO. And of course, it's caused aggravation and consternation with Zelenskyy. This is what they were afraid of, that somehow Trump was going to force the issue. Now, as things stand, I mean, this is Sunday evening, early evening my time, which means that it's early Sunday afternoon on the East Coast of the United States. As things stand, there's still a long, long way till Friday. And we know that from now until Friday, the whole kind of media think tank, foreign policy establishment apparat within the United States will go into action. And of course, America's partners in NATO will also go into action to dissuade Trump from any kind of concessions to Russia, any agreement on accepting Russian territorial gains, any agreement on Ukraine's membership of NATO, and in fact, any concession on anything less than Ukraine returning to its 1991 borders. That's going to be the drumbeat from now until Friday, and it's already happened. So, and if we look at the media coverage, and if we look at what's been going on in Europe among the so-called coalition of the willing, they are indeed in panic that the Ukraine project is under threat. Now, I think it's very important to emphasize that it's by no means a done deal that a deal will be signed in Alaska. It's by no means a done deal that there's some kind of an agreement in the works. In fact, the chances have to be that there won't be an agreement signed, precisely because of the forces, the overwhelming power of the forces that are against any kind of an agreement, against any possibility of bringing this war to an end. So, first of all, take a look at that this was the truth that Trump sent out, saying that this meeting will take place on Friday, August the 15th, and now, if you recall, when the story first broke that there would be a summit between Trump and Putin, the immediate response from the media was that, well, you can't have a summit between the president of Russia and the president of the United States without Zelenskyy being there. And therefore there were a number of stories that appeared in the media to suggest that no, there's not going to be a summit because the Russians are refusing to allow Zelenskyy to take part in the summit. So they're saying no, the condition of the summit is that Zelenskyy is allowed to attend. So here was the Guardian. You can see from the headline, Putin, quote, far from meeting Zelenskyy as Kremlin prepares for talks with Trump. So Moscow dismisses U.S. talk of a three-way summit, saying it was not discussed with Trump envoy Steve Witkoff. And then it said, yet reports on Thursday indicated that the White House and the Kremlin may be further from a summit than Moscow has indicated. So right away they said, no, there's not going to be a summit because Zelenskyy has to be there. A White House official told the New York Post that Trump would only meet Putin if the Kremlin leader met Zelenskyy, something Putin had previously rejected. There were a number of stories like this, and the origin of the stories was always anonymous White House officials. So if this really was the case, if this really was true, that the United States had conditioned the summit on the presence of Zelenskyy, then surely somebody would have gone on the record and said, yeah, no, that's the deal. And Trump himself would have said, no, Zelenskyy needs to attend. That didn't happen. Trump is not somebody who's shy about stating his position and his conditions. So this was really, obviously, this was being leaked from within the White House, from within Trump's national security orbit, suggesting that the condition for the summit is that Zelenskyy attend, and knowing, of course, that Putin had ruled out meeting Zelenskyy, at least at this stage. He didn't rule out in principle meeting Zelensky at some point, presumably at the point at which something would be signed. But at this early stage, Putin had said there's no point in meeting Zelensky. So therefore, any insistence on Zelensky attending would likely lead to Russia absolutely rejecting such a summit. And then ABC News ran with that same story. White House pushes back on Kremlin claims Trump and Putin agreed to meeting. The White House on Thursday pushed back on claims by the Kremlin that a meeting between President Donald Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin had been agreed to with a location secured. A White House official told ABC News that no location has been set and that President Putin must meet with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky for the meeting with Trump to occur. So notice this is ABC News claiming that the White House position is, oh, there's not going to be a summit unless Putin agrees to meet Zelensky. So it's obvious, what the gravamen of these stories is. This is wishful thinking. Those who don't want a summit are obviously putting out the story that there can't be a summit unless Zelensky is there. And of course, if Zelensky is there, then the summit fails, because with Zelensky there, the whole thing just becomes a clown show. For the media, Zelensky doing his usual thing of, listing all his grievances, and the world media would be there cheering him on and feeding him the softball questions, and then so the whole thing would degenerate. And here was Politico that finally seemingly killed the story of the conditionality of the summit. It says Trump won't require Putin meet with Zelensky, contradicting earlier White House statement. President Donald Trump said he would hold a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin regardless of whether Russian leader agrees to meet his Ukrainian counterpart, Zelensky. Trump's comments contradicted an earlier statement from a White House press official. There was no statement. It contradicted earlier fake stories, but there was no statement from a White House press official. This was just simply somebody putting out a fake news that the American side had conditioned the summit on the presence of Zelensky. And then Trump says he doesn't know. Trump said when asked whether Putin would have to meet Zelensky. And then Trump says they would like to meet me, and I'll do whatever I can to stop the killing. Trump earlier told European leaders he intends to meet with Putin in person, followed by a trilateral with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine. Trump told reporters late Wednesday that while there was a really good prospect of a meeting take place, he wouldn't classify it as a breakthrough. And then CNN is still running with this story about Zelensky. CNN says White House hasn't. This is from I think from yesterday. So White House hasn't ruled out Zelensky being in Alaska. So this is already after the naming of Alaska, which was on Friday evening. And so CNN's still running with that story. White House hasn't ruled out Zelensky being in Alaska during Trump-Putin meeting on Friday. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was not named as a participant in the Alaska summit to take place Friday between Trump and Putin. However, the White House has not completely ruled out including Zelensky in some meetings. Two sources familiar with the matter told CNN. One White House official stressed that anything involving Zelensky would likely happen after the Trump-Putin meeting. A White House official said Trump remained open to a trilateral summit with both leaders, but that the White House is planning the bilateral meeting requested by President Putin. Now, the media keep repeating that the meeting was requested by President Putin. The Russians insist that the Americans wanted the summit. And then subsequently, in a news conference, Putin was asked, well, who was it? Who initiated the summit? And then Putin said, well, what does it matter? We both want it to happen. But the American side insists that it was the Russians who initiated it. Um, we don't yet know what the truth of it is. I doubt very much whether the Russians um, initiated this. I think that the Russians wouldn't initiate such a thing unless they were sure that such a summit was likely to yield some results, which I think at this stage that's by no means clear that it will, um, because I mean the Russians I think were badly burned at the 2018 Helsinki summit, in which they were hoping to set American-Russian relations on a new basis, and it turned out Trump was much too weak really to get to impose himself on the agenda to direct his national security staff, to direct the media toward an improvement of relations with Russia. Instead, he just let the whole thing just get out of control. And it was indeed, I think, as Putin said, particularly after that final news conference, a shit show. It was a total waste of everybody's time. So that's why I think the Russians would be wary of meeting unless there was some real serious prospect of progress. And then here again, NBC News today is putting out the story: White House is considering inviting Zelenskyy to Alaska. The White House is considering inviting President Zelenskyy to Alaska, where President Trump is scheduled to meet with Russian Vladimir Putin next week. It's being discussed. One of the people briefed on the discussion said the senior U.S. official and people briefed on the discussion said no visit has been finalized and that it's unclear whether Zelenskyy would ultimately be in Alaska for meetings. A senior administration official said it is absolutely possible. Everyone is very hopeful that would happen. But this at this stage, all of this is quite pointless because if Zelenskyy shows up after the Trump Putin meeting, I mean, maybe even if before, then so what? I mean, Trump can meet, whomever he wants. That isn't really the issue. What they're really trying to suggest is this a trilateral meeting, because I think a trilateral meeting will obviously just make the whole thing nonsensical. But if Zelenskyy shows up before or Zelenskyy shows up afterwards, what does it matter? Um, so now the Russians are getting very hopeful about this meeting, and understandably so, because that really hasn't been a high-level meeting between U.S. and Russian officials really since 2021, the summer of 2021, during at the Geneva summit between President Putin and President Biden. That didn't really lead to anything, obviously, since a few months later there was the war broke out over Ukraine. But really, that's 2021. So that's now more than 4 years ago since there was a meeting between the two presidents. And Trump and Putin hasn't been on U.S. soil. Well, he was on U.S. soil in 2015 when he addressed the UN General Assembly. So that's 10 years ago. And then before that, he was, I think, in 2007, still in the George W. Bush era was the last time he visited American territory. So that's already 18 years ago since he was on American soil. So it's understandable if some Russians are very hopeful. And here's Kirill Dmitriev, who is this Russian investment banker who, if you recall, attended the negotiations in Riyadh. He was part of the Russian negotiating team. That was the one with Marco Rubio and the national security advisor at the time. So but Kirill Dmitriev was there. Obviously, he has a very strong business background, and he knows America very well. He was born in Ukraine, but he was educated at Stanford and the Harvard Business School. And but he, of course, he lives in Russia, but he was very excited. He's obviously an envoy representing Putin, and and here he is. President Trump announces a Russian-U.S. summit with President Putin in Alaska. Born as Russian America, Orthodox roots, forts, fur trade, Alaska echoes these ties and makes U.S. an Arctic nation. So he's emphasizing the um, the common roots in Russia and the United States that Alaska displays, and and then he says, "Let's Russia and the United States partner on environment, infrastructure, and energy in the Arctic and beyond." So obviously, he's a businessman and thinks about all these business opportunities. The problem, of course, is that there won't be any business opportunities unless this Ukraine issue is resolved. There's not going to be, if the war continues and the United States continues to support Ukraine with military hardware, with intelligence, with targeting assistance, then there's not going to be. I mean, if Americans are actually responsible for killing Russians, there aren't going to be mutual investment projects. I mean, that's just not the way the world works. But he goes on, this historic summit, August the 15th, perfect stage. The US and Russia are just 2.4 miles apart between the Diomedes Islands, divided by the international date line. One is yesterday, the other is tomorrow. Let us go from yesterday to tomorrow in peace. You can see that he's, getting very, very excited, speaking in this almost lyrical way. And then here, contrast Biden with Trump. Biden leads to World War III. Putin and Trump lead to peace. And then it goes on. Putin-Trump summit falls on Dormition for Catholics, Assumption, a day honoring Mary's peaceful falling asleep. Alaska's Orthodox Church has Russian roots. And whatever your belief, the feast points to mercy and reconciliation. Choose dialogue, choose peace. And then here, just if we didn't get the message, he posted photographs of Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska, which is quite interesting. I think many people are unaware of the Russian roots of Alaska, the fact that there are indeed Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska. But you can see he may be getting a little ahead of himself. I mean, as I said, there's a long, long way to go before any kind of an agreement is signed, and long, long way to go before we can discern whether Trump will withstand the enormous pressure that is already being applied against him. Enormous pressure not to make any concessions at all to Russia. And then here's the story from Bloomberg, which states what the agreement, supposed agreement that is being negotiated between the Russian and American sides. And here it says Washington and Moscow are aiming to reach a deal to halt the war in Ukraine that would lock in Russia's occupation of territories seized during its military invasion. And then he goes on. Putin is demanding that Ukraine cede its entire Donbass area to Russia, as well as Crimea, which its forces illegally annexed in 2014. So this is very similar to a story that the Wall Street Journal ran that supposedly the Ukrainians would withdraw from the entirety of Donetsk, the Donetsk Oblast. They're more or less being pushed out of Lugansk. So Russia, more or less controls the entirety of Lugansk, 100%. Wait, or it's about 99%. Russians control about 70% of Donetsk. So in other words, the Ukrainians would withdraw from that 30% of Donetsk, and then supposedly Kherson and Zaporozhye, which Russia also claims as constituent elements of the Russian Federation. In Kherson and Zaporozhye, basically there would be a freeze in place, a freeze along the lines of contact. That's what the Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal are suggesting are the terms that are being discussed. Let's keep in mind the terms, whether they are or not. This is entirely coming from the American side. These are leaks coming from within the Trump administration. So we don't really know whether those are indeed the terms that are being discussed. Anyway, it says that would require Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy to order a withdrawal of troops from parts of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions still held by Kiev, and handing Russia a victory that its army couldn't achieve militarily since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. And then such an outcome would represent a major win for Putin, who has long sought direct negotiations with the US on terms for ending the war that he started, sidelining Ukraine and its European allies. Zelenskyy risks being presented with a take-it-or-leave-it deal to accept the loss of Ukrainian territory, while Europe fears it will be left to monitor a ceasefire as Putin rebuilds his forces. So this is this horrific outcome. But of course, it raises the obvious question, which is, well, if you're not going to cede territory to Russia, if you're not going to accept Russian occupation of territory, then what do you intend to do about it? Now, you could continue the war just, for another 2-3 years, which the 3 years of Biden and then the half a year of Trump, which would mean essentially, more and more Ukrainians dying without really much prospect of a Ukrainian victory, without much prospect of Ukraine getting any of this territory back. Or you could escalate and go to war directly with Russia. Now, there doesn't seem to be any desire either in Europe or the United States to go to war with Russia. So since that option is off the table, then the option remains is to continue with this war, and that means continuing to send Ukrainians into the meat grinder, which doesn't seem like a sustainable project in the long term. But that's the problem. So with all the hand-wringing and agonizing and so on, no one actually comes up with a plausible alternative. This is so terrible to accept the loss of territory. Then what are you gonna what alternative are you presenting? And then nobody ever says that. Nobody ever presents that alternative and unacceptable. I mean, it's just simply they've had The governments of Europe and the government of the United States have had 3.5 years to persuade their public to go to war with Russia. And the public is unpersuaded. And there's no support whatever anywhere for a war with Russia. I mean, maybe in the Baltic states, there might be, but nowhere else is there any real support. Um, Anyway, under the terms of the deal that officials are discussing, Russia would halt its offensive in the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions of Ukraine along the current battle lines. The people said they cautioned that the terms and plans of the accord were still in flux and could still change. It's unclear if Moscow is prepared to give up any land that it currently occupies, which includes the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. So that's the plan. This apparently Ukraine withdraws from the Donetsk, from Lugansk, while a freeze on combat is announced in Kherson and Zaporozhye, and then presumably some kind of a negotiation will begin towards a more long-term peace. The problem here, of course, is that it seems unlikely Russia would agree to this, given how many times Putin has said that there can't be a peace unless we've addressed the root causes of the conflict. The root causes are obviously NATO expansion right up to Russia's borders and the creation of a virulently anti-Russian state in Ukraine. This was clearly a Western project, and Russia said that we just can't accept having this hostile regime on our borders. So those are the root causes. This doesn't address the root causes, so it would be surprising that Russia would accept these terms. It's true that this conflict is not about territory, and that one can easily imagine Russia making territorial concessions, maybe territorial concession in Kherson and Zaporozhye, but they're not going to make concessions on what is fundamental to them, and that is this Russophobic, very hostile state on their borders, and the presence of NATO forces, NATO missiles, just a few miles from the Russian border. So here's the Financial Times. Zelenskyy looks to European allies to stop handover of territory to Russia. So everyone now, everyone's got the message. Now's the time to thwart, to stop Trump from handing over territory to Russia. So this is the Financial Times. And then Vladimir Zelenskyy is trying to shore up European opposition to any loss of Ukrainian land to Russia after Donald Trump said that a peace deal might involve some swapping of territory. People close to the Ukrainian president told the Financial Times that he was alarmed by Trump's decision to hold a face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska next week without inviting Ukraine to participate. It's very important to keep in mind here that the media want to fixate on Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy is not the key player in all of this. Zelenskyy was always a kind of a Western puppet, or he was created by the Americans, by the Europeans. He was never really, in any sense, the leader of Ukraine. He never led anything, any more than Ukraine was ever a sovereign country. So this was always a U.S. NATO project. So therefore, Zelenskyy really doesn't matter in all of this. The media want to present it as if somehow Zelenskyy is a major player here. He's not the major player here. The NATO European countries are major players, and of course the the military national security establishment of the United States is a major player here. If had it been left to Zelensky, Zelensky, I think, would have signed a deal in 2019. I think he was genuinely interested in working something out with Russia in 2019 when he was elected on a peace platform. You remember, he won overwhelmingly on the platform of reconciliation with the Donbass and reconciliation with Moscow. He won overwhelmingly, crushed Poroshenko, who wanted the war in the Donbass to continue. He won, but he was almost immediately told by the various extremist, extreme nationalist, fascist elements within Ukraine, you go down the path of peace, and there's not going to be much of you left. And then I think Zelensky was prepared to sign a deal in 2022 in Istanbul, before the intervention, of course, of the Americans and the British, with the special mission of Boris Johnson, who came and told Zelensky, don't sign this deal, because even if you do sign the deal, we, British and the Americans, are not going to accept your signature. So he was ready to sign. I mean, it's who didn't want the deal? The British, the Americans, the French, the Germans. So I kind of feel that the way the media present this, including the alt media, as suggesting that Zelensky is an important player here and that Zelensky stands in the way of a peace deal. Zelensky is not his own man. He's not, he's not running anything. Others are running Zelensky. Anyway, here was Zelensky who then sent out first this message on Telegram, clearly making clear that he wasn't going to accept any kind of surrender of territory. He says Ukrainians defend what's theirs, even those who are with Russia know that Russia is doing evil. Of course, we will not reward Russia for what it has perpetrated. The Ukrainian people deserve peace, but all partners must understand what a dignified peace is. The war must be brought to an end. Russia must end it. Russia started it, and Russia is dragging it out, ignoring all deadlines. That's the problem. And then the answer to the Ukrainian territorial question already is in the constitution of Ukraine. No one will deviate from this, and no one will be able to. Ukrainians will not gift their land to the occupiers. So he's making clear the constitution says we cannot surrender any territory. This is obviously contrary to what Trump had said in that in that news conference, in which he said, "Hey, Zelensky needs to get ready to sign something." So Ukrainians have changed their constitution many times since 1991. I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem. I mean, including the special provision within the constitution that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. This was not in the constitution, but it was included in the Ukrainian constitution after Maidan. And then Ukraine is ready for real decisions that can bring peace. Any decisions that are against us, any decisions that are without Ukraine, are at the same time decisions against peace. They will not achieve anything. These are stillborn decisions. They are unworkable decisions. And we all need real and genuine peace. Peace that people will respect. We are ready to work together with President Trump. So they have to be he has to be very careful. He's been ranting here, in this message on Telegram. But he's careful enough not to offer any criticism of Trump. We are ready to work together with President Trump, together with all our partners, for real and, most importantly, lasting peace, a peace that will not collapse because of Moscow's desires, and so on. And then sends out another message on Telegram. And it says, I thank all of our people who today have shown support, who are fighting for our state, and who are working for Ukraine. I thank every warrior, every citizen of Ukraine who understands that independence is built on dignity. Fear and concessions do not make the life of nations safe. Russia's desires to rule over Ukrainian territories will remain just as desires as long as Ukrainians stand shoulder to shoulder. Okay. Now then, he's been very busy, Zelensky. He then addressed Ukraine, and this is the speech, the address to the Ukrainian people. The answer to the Ukrainian territorial question already is in the constitution of Ukraine. No one will deviate from this, and no one will be able to. And this is addressed by the president, and he says here, President Trump announced preparations for his meeting with Putin in Alaska, very far away from this war, which is raging on our land against our people, and which anyway can't be ended without us, without Ukraine. So this is, it can't be ended without us, without Ukraine. Putin did not believe in our people and therefore made the hopeless decision to try to take Ukraine. This was his main mistake, not taking Ukrainians into account. I believe in our people. Ukrainians are strong. Ukrainians defend what's theirs. Many of the world have sided with Ukraine during the war. Even those who are with Russia know that Russia is doing evil. And of course, we will not reward Russia for what it has perpetrated. And then the Ukrainian people deserve peace, but all partners must understand what a dignified peace is. This war must be brought to an end. Russia must end it. Russia started dragging it out, and then they blah blah about the constitution of Ukraine, and so on. When he talks here, Ukrainians are ready for a real decision to bring peace. Any decision that are against us, and any decision that are without Ukraine, are at the same time decisions against peace. And then it says, we are ready to work with President Trump together with all our partners for real and, most importantly, lasting peace. A peace that will not collapse because of Moscow's desires. And so on. Then but then he, that was his statement. And then the NATO leaders, the leaders of the coalition of the willing, weighed in on this purported summit in Alaska. So here's Macron, who sent out this tweet, who says, I have just spoken again with President Zelensky, as well as with Chancellor Merz and Prime Minister Starmer. So that's it. It's the Macron, Merz, Starmer, the coalition of the irrelevant. We remain determined to support Ukraine, working in a spirit of unity and building on the work undertaken within the framework of the coalition of the willing. So then he brings out that old chestnut about the coalition of the willing. Ukraine's future cannot be decided without the Ukrainians, who have been fighting for their freedom and security for over the years. Europeans will also necessarily be part of the solution, as their own security is at stake. So here he is now, this is par for the course. This is what you would expect. Europe's leaders saying, hey, summit in Alaska, that's about as far from Europe as you can go. Even if it was in Dubai, it'd be a lot closer to where we are than Alaska is. But we need to be a part of the process. But of course, you can't be a part of the process unless you've done something toward peace. And the problem is that the Europeans haven't done anything at all towards peace. I mean, they've just simply been stoking the fire for 3.5 years, continuing to fuel this war. And I think, as Viktor Orban said, I think already quite a while ago, that you can't just demand a place at the table, at the negotiation table. You need to have worked to get there. You need to have come up with peace plans of your own. You need to have shown yourself to be serious about peace, and then you can get a place at the negotiating table. Otherwise, you can just demand and demand, but there's no reason for you to be there. And there really isn't any reason for Macron, Starmer, and Merz to be in Alaska. Anyway, Europeans will necessarily be part of the solution as their own security is at stake. I will continue to coordinate closely with President Zelenskyy and our European partners. No mention here of I will be coordinating with President Trump, and it doesn't sound as if President Trump will be coordinating with President Macron. Anyway, Ursula von der Leyen also weighed in with a tweet, and we welcome President Trump's efforts to stop the killing in Ukraine. Diplomacy combined with continued pressure on Russia is how we will achieve a just and lasting peace. So continued pressure on Russia. One that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and the vital security interests of both Ukraine and Europe. So that's all that matters to her. Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine is not sovereign since Ukraine does not shape its own affairs. And again, the vital security interests of Ukraine and Europe, even though it's Europe that has brought this security crisis on itself. First of all, obviously by the expansion of NATO, but also by getting so heavily involved in a war in non-NATO territory. There was no need to do that, and once they did it, then of course, they can say, well, our security is now involved. Yeah, it's involved, but it shouldn't be. Anyway, David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, also got in on the act. Today, I hosted a meeting with Andrei Yermak. He's the kind of Zelensky's chief of staff. Rustem Umerov, he's the Ukrainian defense minister, and J.D. Vance, the U.S. vice president, and European national security advisors at Chevening House, which is the kind of official, kind of a weekend away for the foreign secretary. So that's where foreign secretaries spend their weekends when they entertain their their colleagues from other countries. So J.D. Vance was there, and you may have seen photo ops of the two of them fishing. I don't know whether David Lammy knows anything about fishing. I mean, I think J.D. Vance does, but I don't know whether Lammy does. But there they were with their fishing rods. So the UK support for Ukraine remains ironclad as we continue working toward a just and lasting peace. And then here was the press release from Downing Street, as you would expect from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who had a telephone conversation with Zelenskyy. Prime Minister spoke to President Zelenskyy of Ukraine this morning, and there it says, well, they looked ahead to the meeting of national security advisors from Europe, Ukraine, and the United States taking place today, hosted by the UK Foreign Secretary and the US Vice President. And that took place at Chevening House, where you had some fishing. They got their fishing rods out, and then you had a meeting with the national security advisors, and Vance was there to brief the Europeans and the representatives from Ukraine, Yermak, on what the American negotiating position is. They agreed that this will be a vital forum to discuss progress towards securing a just and lasting peace. And then this is reporting the telephone conversation between Starmer and Zelenskyy. Both leaders welcomed President Trump's desire to bring this barbaric war to an end and agreed that we must keep up the pressure on Putin to end his illegal war. Notice how they always put these two together. Well, oh yeah, we're absolutely right behind Trump, who's trying to bring this war to an end. Oh, and we're going to keep up the pressure on Putin. which is all they really want to do. But they have to, grit speaking through their teeth. Yeah, yeah, and we definitely support President Trump, even though they're now doing everything in their powers to make sure that this meeting in Alaska turns out to be a flop. The Prime Minister ended the call by reiterating his unwavering support for Ukraine and its people. Why am I not surprised? And then there was a statement after this discussion in Chevening House. A statement was issued on peace for Ukraine. So this is, you can see how much anxiety has now been provoked by this announcement of the summit in Alaska. So we have a joint leaders statement on peace for Ukraine, and who this is: Macron, Meloni, Merz, Tusk of Poland, Starmer, von der Leyen, she's in on this, Stubb of Finland. It's kind of interesting how Finland has managed to worm its way into the big table with all the major powers of Europe. Finland is not a major power. Finland's a very small country. And so it's amazing how it's now here in the big at the big table. So here's the statement issued ahead of President Trump's planned meeting with President Putin. We welcome President Trump's work to stop the killing in Ukraine and the Russian Federation's war of aggression and achieve a just and lasting peace and security for Ukraine. We are convinced that only an approach that combines active diplomacy, support to Ukraine, and pressure on the Russian Federation to end their illegal war can succeed. It doesn't sound like they're in the business of coming to an agreement. Notice the phraseology just in the opening sentence: Russia's war of aggression, support to Ukraine, pressure on the Russian Federation, illegal war. That's just in the opening two sentences. And then we stand ready to support this work diplomatically, as well as by upholding our substantive military and financial support to Ukraine, including through the work of the Coalition of the Willing, and by upholding and imposing restrictive measures against the Russian Federation. Now, let's keep in mind, there cannot be any kind of an agreement if this Coalition of the Willing will continue with their military and financial support to Ukraine. I mean, that's obvious. And the Russians have made this clear time and again that they will not settle for anything that involves continuing NATO military and financial support for Ukraine. In other words, that Ukraine will be able to restart this war in 5 years' time. In other words, there's going to be yet another version of Minsk. So here they are, they're actually presenting their own conditions for sabotaging any deal. And this is what they've been doing now for months and months and months by inserting themselves into any negotiations and insisting on A, we're going to go on militarily supporting Ukraine, B, any ceasefire agreement will be monitored by us. We're going to bring our forces into Ukraine, and we're going to be there monitoring the ceasefire. In other words, NATO will establish itself as a permanent military occupation force in Ukraine, ostensibly monitoring the ceasefire. They know perfectly well that this is unacceptable to Russia. That's why they're inserting this. And then we share the conviction that a diplomatic solution must protect Ukraine's and Europe's vital security interests. Naturally, no mention that any diplomatic solution has to protect Russia's security interests. And that's kind of what started this whole war, that Russia's security interests were not being considered. I mean, if they were being considered, there wouldn't really be a war. And then it says, we agree that these vital interests include the need for robust and credible security guarantees. Here we are. This is it. The robust and credible security guarantees provided by us, by the NATO powers, by the very people that Russia regards as their adversaries. We are going to provide the robust means a serious military hardware, a serious military force, robust and credible security guarantees, permanent NATO military presence in Ukraine. And that's therefore this is what this is their proposal. That enable Ukraine to effectively defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. So that the territorial integrity. So again, that sounds like you're going back to the 1991 borders. Ukraine has the freedom of choice over its own destiny. Well, it really doesn't. I mean, if it had, we wouldn't have a war on our hands. Meaningful negotiations can only take place in the context of a ceasefire or a reduction of hostilities. So now they're going back again to the ceasefire, which, of course, the Russians know, we know, you know, everybody in the world knows, is to be used in order for Ukraine to rearm, for NATO to replace and replenish all military hardware that has been destroyed, and to get ready for round 3 in a few years' time. The path to peace in Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine. So they're clearly a serious rebuke there to Trump, saying you cannot decide anything without Ukraine. But since Ukraine is a complete dependency of the United States, of NATO, then ultimately it will be up to the United States and up to NATO to decide whether they want to continue this war or not. And that isn't dependent on Ukraine. So that simply is incorrect to suggest it's going to be decided by Ukraine. No, it's going to be decided by those who had enabled this war from the beginning. And that goes back to my point that Zelenskyy was never the important player here. We remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. This is this nonsense. I mean, we've talked about this so many times, but what NATO did in Yugoslavia, how NATO used force to steal territory from the Serbs, and the notion that somehow international borders must not be changed by force. NATO changed the international borders by force, by pulverizing the tiny country of Serbia. They did it by force, and now they're so solemn. So yes, well, international borders must not be changed by force. The current line of contact should be the starting point of negotiations. So again, they mean somehow a ceasefire, which is clearly not acceptable. We reiterate that Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the Budapest Memorandum, and successive Russian commitments. So the usual palaver. We underline our unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. So that's it. That's their position. Territorial integrity. So essentially, not going to surrender any territory. We're independent. So Ukraine, continues with its aligning itself with the NATO powers, irrespective of whether this poses a threat to Russia. Well, that's it. This is and we bring out the cliche, unprovoked invasion. We continue to stand firmly by the side of Ukraine. We are united as Europeans and determined to jointly promote our interests, and we will continue to cooperate closely with President Trump and with the United States of America and with President Zelenskyy and the people of Ukraine for peace in Ukraine that protects our vital security interests. So nothing in this document, in the statement of the NATO leaders, suggests that they have any interest at all in peace or any kind of negotiated outcome. They're just simply saying, we absolutely are determined to keep this war going. The last thing that we want is for there to be any negotiated outcome. So everything here is the sort of the cliches that NATO has been repeating for years and years. And then the Times of London, said, "Hey, the European leaders are really, they realize that they're essentially trying to sabotage any possible deal in Alaska. Frantic, the Europeans are now frantic Europeans push their own Ukraine plan before Trump summit." Now, this is very interesting because they say this, their own Ukraine plan. What's the plan? We looked at that statement issued by Downing Street, issued on behalf of the key NATO governments. That didn't sound that there was much of a plan there. And they said leaders are lobbying J.D. Vance with an alternative path to peace, fearing the meeting with Putin could redraw the map. European leaders were pulling together an alternative peace plan for Ukraine on Saturday night before Donald Trump's summit with Vladimir Putin. Hours later, J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, outlined Trump's plan for the summit to senior European and Ukrainian officials at a meeting co-hosted by David Lammy at Chevening. And those present included Jonathan Powell, the UK's National Security Advisor, Andrei Yermak, head of Zelensky's office, and Rustem Umerov, the defense minister. European officials put forward alternative proposals, according to the Wall Street Journal, including that any territorial concessions by Kiev must be safeguarded by ironclad security guarantees, including potential NATO membership. So yeah, that's not a plan. That's a red flag to Russia. Ironclad security guarantees prepared by NATO, potential NATO membership. Then there's no way Russia's going to accept this. I mean, this is a complete waste of time unless your goal is to sabotage any possibility of a deal. Russia must also agree to a ceasefire before any other steps are taken, and that territory can only be exchanged in a reciprocal manner. As again, just keep in mind, Russia had already said that there are two circumstances in which it would accept an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Either Ukraine withdraws completely from the four oblasts, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and announces that it will forego NATO membership. Either that, or NATO commits itself not to replenish Ukraine's military hardware during the time of the ceasefire. So two conditions. Russians are not just going to stop and announce a ceasefire and allow Ukraine essentially to replace its damaged hardware and to redeploy, take a breather, and recover And so that's just not going to happen. No one does that. It never happens in any war that you just simply have a ceasefire, and then maybe perhaps you get a negotiated outcome rather than you allow the other side to recover whatever beating that they'd been taking. Um, And then, it can be exchanged in a reciprocal manner, meaning that if Ukraine pulls out of some regions, the Russians must withdraw from others. The countries I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, they, if the reference is to withdrawing from areas like such as Sumy or Kharkov, which clearly Russia has no interest in incorporating within the Russian Federation. But it's not clear whether that's what they're referring to. The countries involved in the Chevening talks had been expected to sign a joint statement, which we read that. However, several hours after a draft had been worked up, a final version had still not been issued amid reported wrangling over the text. And then Putin is expected to tell Trump that Russia would agree to a ceasefire if Ukraine surrendered Donetsk and Lugansk. In exchange, Putin is thought to be ready to freeze the front lines in Kherson and Zaporozhye. So that's just the same thing, just warmed over from Bloomberg and from the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine, but the sources for this are all coming from the American side. So we have no idea where the Russians would indeed be willing to accept this. Ukraine would be forced to withdraw troops from Donetsk, where its forces control around a third of the territory. But Russia is advancing steadily. Towns and cities such as Kramatorsk and Slavyansk are coming under intense drone and missile attack. And then, after all this, Zelenskyy made another address to Ukrainian people. The path to peace for Ukraine must be determined together with Ukraine. This is fundamental. So here's another address. And then today was an active day of diplomacy. So whenever Zelenskyy says today was an active day of diplomacy, it means he was on the phone to all of the leaders of NATO. He does this every day. He talks to all the leaders of NATO because they are basically his bosses. But they're the ones who give him instructions. So he gets on the phone to all of them, again, another conversation with Keir Starmer, another one with his good friend Emmanuel, and then, good old Friedrich in Berlin. And so he said, since the morning, we've been coordinating with partners, the United Kingdom, France, Finland, Estonia, Denmark, and Spain. First and foremost, there must be a just end to the war, and it depends on Russia. And it is Russia must end the war it started. Second, Ukraine and all partners share the same understanding of the need for a ceasefire. For an end to the killings, only one actor stands against this, Putin. His only card is the ability to kill, and he's trying to sell the cessation of killings as the highest possible price. It is important that this does not mislead anyone. What is needed is not a pause in the killings, but a real lasting peace, not a ceasefire sometime in the future, months from now, but immediately. President Trump told me so, and I fully support it. And then third, I've not yet heard of any of our partners express doubts about America's ability to ensure that the war ends. It's a very convoluted way of saying, well, I have confidence in America because I haven't heard any of my partners in NATO say that they have no confidence in America. No. Has anyone said that they have no confidence in America? No, I think no one has said that they have no confidence in America. So yeah, I can't say that I have no confidence in America. It's a kind of double negative, which doesn't exactly show any great happiness about about the Americans. The president of the United States has the leverage and the determination. Ukraine has supported all of President Trump's proposals starting back in February. A ceasefire, all formats have been supported. We have arranged meetings with the Russian side and have ensured they were constructive. We have carried out exchanges and are preparing further ones. There is already greater understanding regarding the list. We are counting on results. So notice what he's saying here. So look, to Trump, I've done everything you want me to do. Whatever you want, I've done it. But I expect something from you in exchange, and that is that essentially you don't do a deal with Putin. And then likewise, the results are needed at the leaders' levels, dignified results that will save lives, that the world will value, and for which it will be grateful to the leader who delivers them. Contacts with the American side are ongoing, almost around the clock at various levels. We are not making everything public. Everyone can clearly see Putin's tactics. He fears sanctions and he's doing everything to bail on them. He wants to exchange a pause in the war, in the killings, for the legalization of the occupation of our land. He wants to gain territorial spoils for the second time already. So clearly, he has no interest in coming to a deal because he has no interest in, I said this over and over again, he has no interest in surrendering any territory. And he's saying, well, don't do this. The only reason he's suggesting Putin is coming to the negotiating table is he fears sanctions. So the conclusion is, let's escalate the sanctions. Let's make the sanctions even more painful. So this is the line. We're going to hear a lot more of this over the coming days. That the only reason the Russians are willing to negotiate is that Trump's threat of sanctions, or Trump's threat of the secondary sanctions on India and China, the purchases of Russia's energy, the secondary sanctions is what is causing Putin to be serious in negotiations. Therefore, we must intensify the sanctions. That's going to be the message repeated over and over again in the coming days. Now's not the time to negotiate with Putin. Now's the time to escalate the sanctions. He was allowed to take Crimea, and this led to the occupation of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. He did not receive preventive punishment when he amassed a contingent on our borders. This led to the full-scale war and the occupation of even more parts of Ukraine. Now Putin wants to be forgiven for seizing the south of our Kherson region, Zaporozhye, and the entire region of Lugansk and Donetsk regions and Crimea. We will not allow the second attempt to partition Ukraine. So he's Crimea. He wants Crimea back. So this is not. It's no real basis for much negotiations. He wants Crimea. Crimea needs to be returned. So that's the position he's putting forward, and it certainly is also the European position. Ukraine within the 1991 borders. The second attempt to partition Ukraine, knowing Russia, where there is a second, there will be a third, and that's why we stand firm on clear Ukrainian positions. We must end the war with a dignified peace based on a clear and reliable security architecture. Our partners are ready to help us with this. I thank all our people who today have shown support and who are fighting for our state, who are working for Ukraine. I thank every warrior, every citizen of Ukraine who understands that independence is built on dignity, and so on. And then he goes on. I had just received a report from our team in the UK from Andrei Yermak. There have been talks between the security representatives and so on. The meeting was constructive. All our messages were conveyed. Our arguments are being heard. The risks are being taken into account. The path to peace for Ukraine must be determined together and only together with Ukraine. This is fundamental, and it is important that our joint approaches and shared vision work toward a genuine peace, and so on. And then, and I thank everyone who is with Ukraine. So as you can see here, um, and this was entirely foreseeable, that the America's NATO partners, along with Ukraine, are determined to keep the Ukraine project going. They've invested so much of their credibility, of their resources, of their ideological power in this war in Ukraine that they're not just going to give it up. So the prospect of some kind of a deal between the United States and Russia fills them with absolute horror. And they would do whatever they can to ensure that it doesn't happen. We've seen we've seen the outlines of their demands, which is so can't surrender any territory. If there has to be a ceasefire, first of all. During the ceasefire, of course, NATO will be able to continue to transfer weaponry. Ukrainians will be able to redeploy their forces. And basically, Ukraine could use the time of the ceasefire to recuperate and strengthen. But basically, the position of Starmer, Macron, Merz, and the others is we continue as before. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. We will continue to fight to the last Ukrainian because otherwise what? Otherwise, Putin wins. And if Putin wins, then Europe is finished. So there's going to be an awful lot of this in the coming days. And if I were to bet, do I think anything will come out in Alaska? I'd say probably not. I think that the forces, that are arrayed on behalf of keeping this war going, on keeping this Ukrainian project going for another few years, keeping the killing going on for another few years, the forces arrayed are much stronger than any desires on Trump's part. And so I tend to think that if the summit takes place, and I imagine it will take place, it will turn out to be a flop. Nothing really will be decided. Nothing will be signed. There will probably be a vague pledge to continue talking, continue negotiating, but there will be no real end to this conflict anytime soon. Anyway, thank you very much. This was a rather long podcast, but it's these important matters that need to be dealt with in some details. So we'll obviously be coming back to this subject in the coming days, certainly in the days leading up to Alaska. I hope Peter will be back very soon. He has some health issues that he needed to deal with, but I hope that he'll be back within a day or so. So thank you very much today for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.